Hey guys, what's up? MJW006 back with another Heads Up Sit and Go series for you guys. And this series is titled Breaking the Mid Stakes. The first video that we're going to go into today is called Thinking About Lines. And it's not so specific to the mid stakes as the next couple of videos will be when we do live recordings. But this video is more applicable right across the limits. And we're going to focus on certain lines that both our opponents take and that we can take to extract the most value when we're playing heads up sit and goes. So this first slide is basically a summary of the series and what you've actually got, a little bit of a preview to what actually is coming later on in the series, and more specifically what we're actually going to talk about in this video, which is donk lines. So dealing with the lines, the most common plays that fish tend to make against you, and playing against them correctly based on both hand values and ranges that we can possibly deduce, even given that most of the situations that we're going to encounter are going to be readless. That's how we're going to assess the hands as we go throughout this video. I did intend to do it in a hand history replayer, but the hand history replayer and I really don't agree with each other, so I opted to actually just pluck the hands out and just put them into a PowerPoint slide, so it'll be nice and boring for you guys to just listen to me talk and look at PowerPoint slides. Hopefully it'll be a little bit more exciting in the next couple of weeks. Next week we're going to do a live sweat session in the mid stakes, and then in video 3 I've lined up a couple of good thinking regs that I know who are going to give me some of their time to record playing against them. But let's get started on this video anyway, so it doesn't go for too long. The first situation that I'm going to talk about is the min donk lead. Now, I just want to go over something before we actually get too far into things, and that is that all of the situations that we're going to actually discuss in these videos, are going to be readless unless stated otherwise, and I'm pretty sure that all of them are going to be readless, and they're all going to be situations which are early on in the match. The reason for this is basically that, next week we can develop reads, and we can get a feel for how our opponent's actually playing and how our opponent is thinking. When we just have raw hand histories, we really can't deduce our opponent's range based on other actions. We can only take that raw hand history that's in front of us and decide what's the best play based on the maths, based on what I've seen over time through my experience. And basically that's what we're drawing on throughout the course of this video. The reason I've pulled these certain things to light is basically through experience. This is what you're going to encounter commonly. This is how we can react to it. You need to show discretion when you're playing poker. You need to make your own decisions based on certain situations, based on reads and based on what you've seen earlier on in the match. But in these situations that we're going to talk about today, we really just need to talk about them kind of independently and in a broad sense, so that we can get a feel for how to play in certain situations. So the first situation that we have here is the min donk lead, and this is one of the most common situations that's actually going to come up at all levels, basically, whether you're playing in the low stakes, mid stakes, or high stakes. One thing that you're going to see from the fish a lot is this min donk lead. I haven't put cards into this example, and this example flops only there kind of for visual purposes, basically, because what I'm going to say to you is essentially you need to treat a min donk lead as a check. So if you did have intentions of c-betting a certain flop texture, or if you did have certain intentions of checking a certain flop texture back, then that's exactly what you should do. However, all it's going to be is that instead of c-betting, you're going to actually be raising, and instead of checking, you're actually going to be calling a one big blind bet. The difference is rather minimal. On a flop texture such as the one that we have in front of us, an ace 3-7 flop, we would have been c-betting this flop a huge percentage of the time. Therefore, we're actually going to raise here, treat it as a check, and if our normal c-bet was 80, that's exactly what we're going to do. The reason why we're actually going to make the raise rather than calling is we're actually getting, our cards don't really matter in this situation. We're getting 1.75 to 1 on the bet by itself, and this is a really high percentage play to actually raise the min-donk lead. On top of that, on top of the fact that you actually take this down a huge percentage of the time, the hand's going to be reasonably easy to play, on later streets anyway. So if we actually were going to c-bet and then shut down, then we're just going to raise and shut down anyway. So it's not actually going to complicate things more than what it would had our opponent just checked anyway. So that's certainly the most straightforward situation that we're actually going to come across, but it's also one of the more common situations that you're actually going to come across. The next situation is the full pot donk lead, or the close to pot donk lead. It's relatively similar. The odds that you're actually going to have on making a raise or calling are going to be really similar as well, whether the bet size be 3/4 pot or whether it be full pot. You're going to find it's a really similar situation. So this is an actual hand history that I've pulled out. Pre-flop, we're dealt king 10 of diamonds. We're the pre-flop raiser and our opponent calls. We get a flop of ace 5-7, which is a really dry flop and very similar to the one that we spoke about in the last slide. And our opponent, rather than min-donk leading at us, he actually hits the pot button, as they love to do on full tilt, and bets 120 at us. So in this situation, our hand in itself doesn't have all that much value. Without reads, our opponent's range in this situation is going to consist of a lot of air based on my experience. And this is only based on my experience, but our opponent's range here is a ton of air. So we're getting three. If we did raise here, I'd suggest that you raise to around about 320. You're making it 320 to win 240, which is not, it's not as good as the last situation when you were actually making a raise of a min-donk lead. The odds, aren't as good as what they were in the last situation, and you're actually bloating the pot. But based on my experience, again, this is a really high percentage play to actually make a raise in this situation. Folding as well is it's a neutral EV play. So folding in this situation is fine. If you prefer to fold and wait until you develop a better read on your opponent's tendencies, then that's certainly fine. Raising is also fine. I think calling would be terrible in this situation, obviously. Now, the reason why raising takes the pot down a large percentage of the time is that there's very few hands on a board such as this that our opponent can actually call with. There's only the one genuine draw out there, which is the 6-8. There's a couple of gut shots and things like that out there, but we really can't. Our opponent isn't going to be getting the odds to be calling with them type of draws anyway. So by making a raise, which is a relatively small raise, albeit, it's definitely a plus EV bet is what I'm trying to say. There's more ace-x hands in our range as a pre-flop raiser than there is in our opponent's range. On top of that, if our opponent was to have a strong ace-x hand, for example, or a two-pair type hand or a set, we do expect them to be 3-betting a lot of them hands pre-flop. So 5, 7s, aces, ace-king, ace-queen. We expect them to be 3-betting them hands a decent percentage of the time pre-flop. And if they didn't 3-bet them hands, then we tend to feel that they would be check-raising them hands anyway. And this is a general assumption against non-thinking players, or fish as we like to call them. And it makes way more sense that we have an ace-x hand in our range here than it does our opponent have an ace-x hands. We have the advantage of position, and I definitely like to go ahead and raise in this situation early on in the match. And in both of these situations, in the first situation, the min donk lead, and in the pot donk lead, as soon as you actually establish what it means from your opponent, because quite typically, once you find out what it means, it remains the same. Even 6 months down the track, you may play that opponent again. So taking a note as soon as you find out is definitely something which is massively plus EV for your future success. If you are to play that player again, it's really easy to be able to revert to that read and be able to play much better against that opponent early on in a match when you haven't developed them game flow reads, to have that known. So take a note on it if you do find out early on. And the best way to find out early on is to actually go ahead and raise. If they do continue, it's a pretty straightforward situation. If they raise you on this flop, it's a pretty straightforward situation. You can pretty safely shut down if they call. Plus, we have a couple of backdoors as well, so we can never discount that either. These next two situations here, well, let's just move on to the King 9-4 flop, for example. In the same situation, with King 10 of diamonds, given that our opponent calls pre-flop and leads this flop, the reason why I'm saying that we should be actually raising this flop in the first situation on the Ace 5-7 flop is exactly the reason why we probably should be calling in the second situation. Against hands which are the strong part of our opponent's range, if they were to have them type of hands, like hands which actually have us beat in this situation, then in all likelihood, if we raise this flop, we're never folding anyway. So we're actually going to get it in regardless against them hands. There's very, very few scare cards on later streets for us, but we want our opponent to actually, if they are running air here, so if they are donk leading with air here, we want to give them a chance to actually fire again, because we're getting more value out of their air range and exactly the same amount out of their strong hands. So because the board is not draw heavy at all, there's very few scare cards for us, we pick up that air range. So we get our value range and our air range by just calling. Raising's folding out all worse hands, and he's continuing with hands which are towards the stronger part of his range. I'm not going to say that we always we only continue against hands which are better than ours, because we actually, if we were to raise, we get hands sometimes which are worse, but there's more better hands that actually continue than there are worse hands which continue if we were to raise that flop. The second situation, I'm going to condone calling as well in this situation, and it's not for the same reasons as what the King 9-4 flop is, but it's more for what I said before, is if we were to raise the Ace 10-2 flop, which is once again a really dry flop, we're actually only going to get it in against better hands. Well, we're going to be raised by better hands, and he's going to call with better hands, but he's going to be folding out all worse hands. In this situation, controlling, I hate the word pot control, but I'm going to say it to a degree. We're going to control the size of the pot with showdown value. There's very few scare cards anyway. There's more scare cards than the last situation, but there's still very few. And we're going to be able to play this hand reasonably safely on later streets. The hand's basically going to play reasonably easily for us on the turn and on the river. So flatting there and reevaluating the turn and reevaluating the river is probably the best situation there. The next situation is another common one, which is the check min raise. This is where we're the pre-flop raiser, we c-bet, and we get check min raise. I've got 4 types of flops here on this slide, and in all 4 situations, once again, we're going to be readless. It's going to be early on. We're going to be the pre-flop raiser with 7-8 offsuit. So with the first flop, the King 2-3 flop, this is a situation where it's a pretty easy fold, basically. And I think this is relatively self-explanatory, obviously. But even though we can kind of attack this flop, very similarly to the last situation where I said that we can fold and it will be neutral EV, or we can raise and it takes it down a huge percentage of the time. Very similarly here, we can actually 3-bet this flop and take it down a huge percentage of the time because our opponent's check min raising range on this board is made up of a pretty decent percentage of air, and then the rest of it is the only hands which are going to continue are King X hands, obviously, on this flop. The only problem with it is, and very similarly to the last situation, is that it can be quite costly and in some situations best left until we actually have reads on what a check min raise means, and probably more so than the donk lead can probably be left till we have developed some form of read, because a check raise, whether it be a check min raise or a normal check raise, is typically stronger than what a donk lead actually is. So I like to actually early on in a match be letting go of a hand like 7-8, which is, is obviously a hand which has no value whatsoever, even on a dry flop like this, rather than bloating the pot when we're just going to have to fold if he does continue. So that's basically how I would go about playing this first flop texture. The second one is a little more interesting because it's a relatively wet board, and some argument can be made for not c-betting this flop, but early on in a match I like to be c-betting a huge percentage of the time to see how my opponent's going to actually react. And with 7-8 on a flop like Jack 6-8 with, 2 diamonds in this example, or 2 of 1 suit, so it's a relatively wet texture. With middle pair on that board, we certainly get called by worse hands. When we get check min raised on this board, I think calling is certainly the best option in this situation, but you need to be able to play effectively on other streets, and you need to be aware, because there are so many bad cards and very, very few good cards for our hand, we're going to have to play really cautiously. Now, our opponent's obviously offering us great odds to actually call a check min raise on a flop like this, so we actually do, a huge percentage of the time we're going to be getting really good odds. That's why we make the call, but you really need to be careful playing on later streets with this hand. So the best case scenario obviously is getting a safe turn card and having it check down or something like that. So on a flop texture like that, calling the check min raise, raising would be terrible, folding not so bad, calling is probably the best option. The next two situations, the next two flops, really deal with flopping monsters, but very different monsters. So the first situation where we flop the nuts with our 7-8 on a 6-9-10 board, when we get check min raised on a board like this as the pre-flop raiser, I really think that we have to go ahead and 3-bet this type of flop. The reason being, there's a lot of hands which are actually going to get it in with you on this flop, which are going to be scared off on the turn. And on top of that, there's going to be a decent amount of cards on the turn which are actually going to be, reasonably bad cards for us, even though we have flopped the nuts. It's the kind of board which our opponent either has a pair, so a lot of 10x hands will continue against the 3-bet on this flop. Even some stronger 9x hands are going to continue, and a ton of draws are going to continue with us on this flop. Now, the stronger made hands on this flop are going to be happy to continue because they like to use the excuse that we can easily be 3-betting this flop with a draw. And the drawing hands, obviously, will be happy to continue against a 3-bet on this flop because they have a draw. This is a type of flop where this is our best street of value, and by our opponent reopening the betting, we need to take advantage of that and get as much chips as we can in on this type of flop, rather than slow playing and watching gross cards roll off on the turn and on the river and not actually getting the maximum value for our hand. Conversely, in this last flop, the 7-7-3 flop, there are very few hands when we get check min raised which are actually going to be able to continue against a 3-bet. Obviously, there's not many 7x hands in his range because we have one of the 7s. So the amount of hands which are likely to continue given the action, that is that we raise pre-flop and then our opponent just flats from the big blind, we see bet and get check min raised. A huge percentage of his range is actually just pure air on this flop for check min raising us. Therefore, we want to allow our opponent to bluff on later streets when there's very, very few hands which can actually continue against a 3-bet on that flop. So basically, we need to be starting to think about what street is the best street to get value out of when we're thinking about how to continue against certain bet types. So whether that be the check min raise, the min donk lead, the full pot donk lead, we need to think about what percentage of their range we fold out, and what, based on their actions, what percentage of their range is air and what percentage of their range is better hands or hands which can continue against a raise. Okay, so the next thing is the pot turn donk lead, which is something which is becoming way more common than what it has been in the past. This is a tendency which is really starting to develop and really starting to become way more prominent. In this situation, we have Jack 10 of diamonds, where the pre-flop raiser once again, and our opponent flats out of the big blind once again. We get a flop which is pretty good for our hand. We flop a gut shot and 2 overcards. Our opponent checks and we decide to go ahead and c-bet. The board's relatively dry. We have basically the best draw plus a backdoor flush draw. So we're going to go ahead and c-bet this flop because we take it down. Obviously the c-bet is plus EV in itself, given the sense that we take this pot down a huge percentage of the time just by the c-bet. On top of that, we build the pot for when we actually do make hands on later straights. Our opponent calls, making the pot 280 at that point in time. We get a turn which is the ace of diamonds, giving us a flush draw and a gut shot, but our opponent leaves full pot at us on this turn. Now, the math of the situation is basically that we're getting 2-1 on our money, on a call that is, and we have 13 cleanouts most of the time. A lot of people look at this turn and think, wow, that's a great turn card for us. We've got another draw now. We've got 13 outs. The thing is that if we just take our 13 outs, our direct odds actually aren't good enough to make a call here. Given that 13 outs at this point in time, we're going to get there about a quarter of the time. We're only actually getting 2-1 on our money. What we need to start thinking about is, are we getting the right implied odds? That is our opponent stacking off even when we make our hand a lot of the time? And do we pick up bluffs enough of the time? Now, given our hand strength being jack high at this point in time, we're not actually going to be able to pick off bluffs often at all, well, basically ever. And even if our opponent does shut down on the river, given this line, we don't have the best hand a large percentage of the time anyway. So sometimes we're going to get ourselves in really tricky river situations where we miss the river and our opponent checks. We're not likely to have the best hand. Do we bet or do we just check it back and cut our losses? What I suggest doing is basically folding this turn. And it may seem a little on the nitty side, but given what I've just gone through, I think it's the best option, particularly without reads. If you have a read on your opponent doing this, then by all means you can take different actions. But with readless, given this line, I think folding's the best. We only have 140 in the pot at this point in time, which is quite often only about 10% of our stack. So we're not taking a huge loss by just folding this turn and then waiting for kind of until we develop better reads on our opponent and we do kind of get into our opponent's mind a little bit on what they're actually thinking at certain points in time. So the other thing is basically if we were to call, we're going to have 420 roughly in the pot, which is usually about 1/3 of our stack, and it's going to be really hard for us, given that we miss the river 75% of the time. We're actually going to have 2/3 of our stack in. Sorry, not 2/3, 1/3 of our stack in, and have no hand value whatsoever on the river. So folding is quite often the best option on that turn card. This other flop that I've just put down the bottom here is reasonably similar given the action going that way. It's more favourable for us, obviously, for the fact that we have top pair, but probably less favourable for us in the sense that there's more made hands that actually make sense for our opponent in this situation. Once again, this is a situation where if we were to just call the Jack of Spades turn, when it puts 3 spades out there, we quite often get ourselves in tricky situations on the river because there's actually going to be a fair amount of rivers over cards we're not really going to love. Any spade we're not really going to love. Any 3 or 4 we're not going to love. Any 7 or 8 we're not going to love. So even if we do call and get a decent river card, we're not going to be all that happy to be calling 2 big bets on this board, given that our opponent has really bloated the pot. So this is another situation where it may be slightly nitty, but early on without reads, on a 2-5-6 Jack with 3 spade board, and boards similar, obviously these are just examples and you have to use some form of, you have to think about similar textures and use these boards as textures, not necessarily exactly this board. Similar boards to this, similar situations like this, I think folding this turn is best until you can develop a stronger read on what your opponent's doing. And this goes back to something that I spoke about, I think it was in the last series, which is trying to avoid really marginal situations, and especially when your opponent wants to bloat the pot and finding yourself in a marginal situation when quite clearly against less competent opponents, you're going to be able to find better situations. So this next line, the check call flop, check raise turn, is something which is, well, I think this is strength 85% of the time, maybe even more, based on my experience. This is one of the strongest lines which you are going to see out of the less competent opponents that you're actually going to play in the mid and higher stakes. Just as a description, where the pre-flop raiser, our opponent check calls the flop, we fire a second barrel, and our opponent check raises when we fire the second barrel. We're going to, on this first flop, we have ace-king in all 3 of these situations, but we're just going to deal with this first flop first. As an ace-9-9 flop, we see bet, the 4 turn, pretty good card to fire a second barrel at. Our opponent check raises us on this board. When we actually think about our opponent's range here, there's obviously some air in his range. There's also some ace-x hands in his range. But the large majority of his range, and as I said, this is purely based on my experience, is around about 85% of the time, this is going to be 9x. Ace-x raise, check calling and then check raising doesn't make a whole lot of sense, particularly when we have one of the aces, unless he has a strong ace, which is also less likely because he didn't 3-bet pre-flop and he didn't check raise the flop. So when we actually think about the range of hands that our opponent check calls the flop with, a lot of it is actually going to be either A, air, or B, 9x. So when he check raises his turn, as much as I hate folding top pair, top kicker, well, 2-pair top kicker, it's a situation where quite often it's actually going to be right. And I feel like such a nit for actually saying this, but it's so true. And I think being able to recognize this, and it took me a long time, and probably still even now, I have a really hard time even folding. And okay, so I very rarely actually fold myself. But the reality of it is that when you do continue in this hand, you're going to see 9x more often than you're not going to see 9x. On the second flop, we flop top two pair, our opponent check calls, and the turn rolls off with the Jack of Hearts, and our opponent check raises. This situation is very different from the first situation. Not just that we have top two pair and there's no chance. Well, there's fewer chances to have trips or a set in this case, but there's a lot more worse strong hands that our opponent can be check raising this turn with. So we see about this flop. Of course, if our opponent has a set, if our opponent has one hand which actually got there on the turn, which is Queen 10, then we're actually beat. But there's also them strong hands, them strong made hands like King Jack, King 9, Ace 9, Ace Jack, even hands like Ace 10, Ace Queen. Okay, there's these hands which are actually going to take this line, which are worse strong hands. So on a board like this, even though this line from our opponent is really strong, we're still going to be continuing with the hand. I'm never folding really, and I'm more likely to actually try to get it in on the turn than I am to call the turn, because of the amount of worse made hands which are in our opponent's range. The third situation is a little different again, in the sense that when our opponent check calls this flop and check raises this turn, similarly to the first situation, I think you actually see 7x a pretty large percentage of the time. Not as much as you do in the first situation, because the board is slightly more drawy, well, a lot more drawy, obviously. So there are actually going to be worse hands in our opponent's range that they're kind of spazzing out on and trying to represent the 7. So there are worse hands which are actually going to continue and are actually going to take this line. But in saying that, it's a really, really close situation. I don't actually like calling when you do get check raised on this turn. I like either getting it in or folding. And the reason is sometimes you actually get it in against worse King X hands. You obviously get it in against some draw hands, even though it doesn't make all that much sense for him to be check calling that flop and check raising the turn with a draw. You're actually going to see it more often than you would expect. So even though the check call, check min raise, why do I keep saying min raise? Check raise turn represents strength. You have to really think about the hands which are worse, which will get it in, and then the hands which are better, which are obviously crushing you as well at this point in time. So the first situation, I'm leaning towards folding a large percentage of the time. The second situation, I'm trying to get it in, and in the third situation, I'm either getting it in or folding. Without reads, this is all we can do. Once you do develop reads on this line, sometimes you will find that your opponent takes this line as a bluff. But as a default, as I said, about 85% of the time, this is going to be a strong line from your opponent. So now we're just going to move on to our value lines and why we're going to take certain lines in certain situations. And in this first scenario, we're dealing with limped pots where we're out of position. All of these three hands are actually hand histories which I've grabbed, and all three of them were limped pots. And what I want to display here is why donk leading is better in a lot of these situations than actually check raising. In the first situation with 9-10 of diamonds, obviously we flop a monster. But by check raising this flop, obviously we're happy to get it in on this flop regardless of what happens. But what we do by checking with intentions of check raising is we give our opponent a chance to check back. Therefore, we miss the opportunity to build the pot. When we do check raise here, we get folds a huge percentage of the time anyway, especially in a limped pot when there's not necessarily a lot of strong aces or anything like that are going to continue. And early on in a match without reads, we can't just assume that our opponent's going to c-bet. Therefore, donk leading these type of boards is, A, it's a great way to build the pot. B, it's a great way to control the pot, and have control of the pot, I mean. And being able to make better informed decisions on later streets. So, by donk leading this flop, which I would be donk leading full pot here, and sometimes we get raised there. We get raised by the stronger hands. We get raised by total air sometimes, so we get more than we would by check raising, because if we check raise in this situation, we pick up a c-bet when he folds. If we donk lead here and then 3-bet when he raises us, we actually pick up more chips than what we would have just from a pure c-bet. So it's certainly a way to build the pot and win more chips from air. When we actually do get there, I think it's also a little less believable from our opponent that we did actually barrel off with the draw as well. So it can certainly be advantageous when we flop a huge draw like this to just go ahead and give ourselves that extra opportunity of both building the pot and taking the pot down uncontested when we do have these big draws, even though I hate taking the pot down uncontested when I flop a monster like that. So in the next situation, we're dealt ace-4. Once again, it's in a limped pot. Our opponent limps, we check it away. We get an ace-king-7 flop with 2 spades. We can check call this flop definitely, but similarly to the first situation, we can't just assume that our opponent's going to c-bet this flop. So what we want to do is we actually want to just go ahead and build the pot. If this was a raised pot, it'd be a very different situation, and I'd be more inclined to be checking with intentions of calling. And that would be purely based on the fact that our opponent's hand ranges are obviously weighted towards stronger hands when it's a raised pot as opposed to a limp pot. So in this situation here, we flop top pair. There are some draws there, so there's actually some turn cards which we're not going to like. And once again, we control the pot and we can actually make better informed decisions on later streets. And even though sometimes our opponents just flat out just fold, quite often it's not really believable that we have a strong hand in this situation, or top pair when it's an ace-high flop to our opponent when we check pre-flop. So it can also be a good way to get really thin value. By thin value, I mean that our opponent actually ends up calling us down relatively light as well. In the last situation, once again, our opponent limps. We have Jack-8 offsuit. We check it away. We flop top pair on a really wet board. And in this situation, I don't really think balancing your range is all that important, because I could relate it back to the first hand and say, well, we're doing it with draws and we're doing it with our top pair type hands as well, and it's a balancing our range thing, because it's really not. Heads up sit and goes, you're not going to have history a lot of the time in heads up sit and goes to the degree where balancing your range and merging your ranges is all that important, or of any significance whatsoever, unless you're going to play regs on a relatively frequent basis. So the reason why I'm actually leading this flop is, well, first and foremostly, it's for value. I don't want to check here, our opponent check back, and the turn roll off a heart, and then we're kind of stuck in a situation where we did have an opportunity to get value. Now we have a situation where we have to fold. In this situation, by betting the flop, this is the best value street for us at this point in time, obviously. We get called by draws, we get called by worse pair hands, which are using us having draws as an excuse, and we get the opportunity to build the pot and control the pot and play more effectively on later streets. So for example here, if we lead this flop and our opponent calls, we get a 2 of clubs turn. Once again, we can pretty safely lead again on the turn. If our opponent calls again, and we find ourselves, and once again this is a real hand history, and we get an ace of spades river, we can pretty safely check here to induce bluffs. because our opponent's likely to bluff with busted flush draws some percentage of the time. They may also value town themselves and value bet thin with like 9x. And the times that they actually were floating us with an ace-x hand, which you are going to find some percentage of the time on a heart board when they may have like the ace of hearts, or they may have ace of clubs, 5 of hearts or something like that, and just make excuses to be calling us down and actually get there on the river. We're actually going to lose. We're going to be able to control the pot size by just check calling this river. So we're going to be able to play relatively safely on later streets by just donk leading rather than giving our opponent control of the pot and letting them control how many chips go into this pot and having no real idea where we stand at certain points in time. If we donk lead and get raised on this board, we can pretty safely call it and then start reevaluating based on later streets as well. So donk leading can certainly simplify things for you, particularly with outreads. It can certainly frustrate your opponent and start giving you control of the match in general, not just control of these certain hands, but you can also start gaining control of the match as well by doing this and constantly frustrating your opponent by winning pots out of position as well as in position. So the next situation is a value line which I take some of the time, and it's a very different situation to the next one we're going to look at, and we need to really think about texture when we're talking about these two next situations. The first one that I'm going to talk about is actually checking back the turn to make better river value decisions, and induce bets from worse hands. Quite often, these situations what we're talking about is a hand which we're likely to get 2 straights of value, but it's going to be hard to get 3 straights of value, and deciding which straight is best to get value on. In these 3 situations, the best straight for us is to actually try to get it on the river rather than on the turn, because the turn is actually going to fold out a lot of worse hands. So in the first situation, we have Jack 10. We get an Ace 9-8 flop, which is a really nice board to c-bet. In all of these situations, we are in position. We were the pre-flop raiser. And we're going to c-bet this Ace 9-8 flop for obvious reasons a huge percentage of the time. And we turn the nuts. In this situation right here, our opponent check calls the flop. Are they likely to check call this turn often? Are they folding this turn often? This turn card, let's just change my cards for a second to 2-6, for example. If I have 2-6 in this situation, I'm going to barrel this turn card a huge percentage of the time. And the reason why I'm going to barrel this turn card a huge percentage of the time is that I get folds. I get folds a huge percentage of the time when I actually double barrel this board. For that reason, I think our opponent is way less likely to call a bet from us on the turn when they check than they are on a safe river when they check. So if we were to bet this flop, check back the turn, and then bet the river, we're more likely to get called on the river than we are by betting the flop, betting the turn. And the reason is that our line actually looks weak. There's not that many draws. We had the only real strong draw on this board, and it obviously got there. So there, other than maybe 6-7, the only real draw out there was our draw, and it's certainly the most obvious draw because people are thinking Jack 10 all the time because it's such a sexy hand. So in this situation, our best value street is actually the river, because if our opponent was floating us with random air hands, then they're going to lead this river at us and we're going to have an opportunity to raise. If they did have ace-x hands, they may very well have called this turn and called the river as well, but it's going to amount to this. They're going to call a river raise as well with an ace-x hand, so we're actually going to earn the same amount of chips from our opponent whether when they do have an ace-x hand or a 2-pair hand for that matter, whether we bet the turn or whether we raise the river. where we're going to get the same amount of chips, possibly even more, by checking back the turn and raising their river lead. In the second situation, we have 5-6 of diamonds, and the flop comes 6-6 ace. Now, this is a situation where I basically always c-bet, and I'm c-betting to build the pot. I'm c-betting for value, because it's one of them situations where either your opponent's continuing regardless or they're not, because with the ace out there, even if they do pair up, they're unlikely to continue anyway. So I c-bet this flop, our opponent calls, we get a king turn. Now, if our opponent was floating with pocket pairs, or our opponent was floating with air, he's unlikely to call another bet on this king of spades turn. So if I did have air, this is a decent card to double barrel. Even though I'm not going to double barrel often on this board, it's going to be one of the better cards to actually fire. Given that we do have basically a nut hand in this situation, we need to think about how likely we are to get 3 streets of value. And based on my experience, we're not actually all that likely as you'd think to get 3 streets of value out of ace-x here. And very similarly to what I just explained in the first situation, if he does have ace-x here, if we check back this turn, he's going to bet the river a pretty large percentage of the time anyway, because our line looks so weak. When he does bet the river, he's likely to call a raise from us as well. So we're not actually missing all that much value. If we triple barrel and he calls 3 streets, then we may get a bet of 80, 160, and 320 across the three straights. If we bet the flop, check the turn, and raise the river, we're going to get 80 in on the flop. He's going to bet at us like 120 on the river, and we're going to make a raise to like 400. So we're going to get similar amounts into the pot either way. I think we pick up more range though, because if our opponent does have air hands, we're likely to induce a bluff from them on the river. And secondly, if our opponent does have one of them middle pocket pair type hands, by checking back the turn, it looks much weaker, and they're way more likely to actually call the river than they are to call the turn card. So if our opponent has 9s, for example, if we fire the flop in the turn here, he's likely to fold the turn if he did call the flop. Whereas if we check back the turn and bet the river, he's more likely to actually call with them 9s than he was on the turn. In the last situation, very, very different to the first two situations, because we don't have a super strong hand like we do in these situations. We flop top pair with 8-9 of diamonds here. Once again, we c-bet, our opponent calls. We get a king of hearts turn. Now, this board you're going to find you're way more likely to get floated by random overcards. But if I did have air once again, this turn card is a great turn card for me to double barrel when my opponent checks. So that's exactly the reason why I'm not checking back the turn for pot control. I'm actually checking the turn back somewhat for value, because what we do is we pick up them random air hands. We'll bluff the river a huge percentage of the time on a board like this, once again because our line looks so weak. We don't have a 3 straight of value hand, we have a 2 straight of value hand, and this is how you have to start thinking about the hand. On top of that, if he did have like king 10 and randomly floated us, then we're actually losing much less when we do actually call the river. We're not going to be able to raise the river a lot of the time on a board like this, but we are going to be able to call and safely get our 2 straights of value. If he does check the river, we're going to be able to safely value bet and see if we can get a call out of some random 1 pair hands as well. Okay, so hopefully we've covered that. This is where what I want to talk about now is where betting the turn is actually better than checking the turn to induce, as we spoke about in the last situation. The reason why these hands are different is because it comes back to that, where is our best street of value, as I was talking about in the last couple of slides. And our best street of value in these situations is actually on the turn. Now, in this first situation, once again, where the pre-flop raiser, our opponent calls, and they check call. We have a7, sorry, in this first situation. Our opponent check calls a 7-6-2 flop with 2 hearts. When he check calls this flop, sure, he's got a lot of random overcard floats, as there was in the very last situation that we spoke about. There's also a lot of draws, though, in his range. So when he actually does check call this range, there's more draws which can be in his range than there are random overcard floats, as there were in the last situation. We get an ace of spades turn, which is obviously a really good card for us, but it's also a card which, if I had air, I would be barreling, because I think I get folds a reasonable percentage of the time. In this situation, it's a really good card for us, and we don't necessarily want folds. But in saying that, we want to get the most value that we possibly can out of all of his draws. So by betting the turn, we get value out of his draws, his one pair type hands, and sometimes if he does have a random ace-x hands in his floating range, we will get calls there as well. So we're going to fold out a fair percentage of his air range that we may have been able to induce a bluff out of. But he's unlikely, given the board texture, to actually bluff the river. He's less likely to bluff the river given the board texture, because I can quite often... It's quite easy for him to think that I'm going to use the excuse that all the draws missed, I'm going to call. So our best value street here in this situation is to actually try to get the value out of them draws, and it's right now on the turn, because if we wait to the river and the draws miss, then we're going to miss value from the busted draws if he checks the river to us. If we are facing one of the stronger hands, we give ourselves the opportunity to get 3 streets of value out of him, because we actually have turned a really good card. And all of the air hands, we're not missing that much out of them anyways. So in the second situation, we have 5-6 of diamonds. We get a flop, which is once again a really good flop to c-bet in king 4-7, and our opponent check calls this flop again. The turn rolls off the straight for us, which is the nut straight at this point in time, but it also puts a flush draw out there. In a situation like this, there's just an absolute ton of worse hands which can call us on this turn card. Conversely, once again, there's going to be a lot of river cards which either A, kill our action, because if a club rolls off on the river, a 9 or a 10 or a 5 or a 6, we're not going to be super thrilled about putting a huge amount of chips in on a lot of rivers. So our best street of value in this situation is to actually go ahead and try to get value out of them drawy hands, plus potentially give ourselves 3 streets of value against like King X type hands, or even 2 pair type hands for that matter. Particularly when the flush draw blanks out on the river, it's quite easy for them to check call another street, or check raises for that matter on another street, given that all the draws missed. Well, the flush draw missed in their mind. So when the most obvious draw there misses, we're more likely to get value out of them 1 pair or 2 pair type hands. This is our value street. The turn is our value street. We're more likely, there's just an absolute ton of draws which are actually calling us on this turn, but they're not actually going to put any chips on the river. So we just need to go for it on this board. The third, very similarly, is we have aces pre-flop. We raise, our opponent calls. We get a 10-6 jack flop with 2 clubs. So it's a relatively wet board. It's obviously not the prettiest sight when you're sitting there with aces. And we get what, by some people's standards, can be considered a relatively ugly turn. To some degree, it is a relatively ugly turn. And unfortunately, this is a spot where bet folding is going to be relatively appropriate on this turn, if we were to get check raised. And that goes back to what we spoke about before, the check call, check raise line. But in saying that, This is once again our value street. We can still get value out of flush draws. We can still get value out of what is likely to be now like one pair hands plus a straight draw. There's just an absolute ton of hands on this type of board which are going to be able to call the flop and turn, but not necessarily call the river. So, and as well as that, this isn't really the type of board that we're going to be able to effectively induce bluffs from our opponent on a lot of rivers as well, because the board is so wet, they're much less likely to bluff at us on the river, should we check back this turn and make our hand look weak. So I hope you can see the difference between why the situations when we bet the turn on much wetter boards as opposed to checking back the turn on much drier boards, or when we have really, really strong made hands where we're unlikely to get 3 streets of value, as opposed to these situations where we're likely to get value out of draws and set ourselves up for potentially 3 streets of value as well. So the last 2 slides now, I hope I haven't bored you too much by now. We haven't got far to go. These next 2 slides I'm talking about river bet sizing. In the first situation, I'm going to talk about the overbet, and this is a hand that I've actually pulled out that I played recently. Pre-flop, our stacks are 1500, our opponent raises to 60, and we flat ace-9 of spades out of the big blind. We get a flop of ace-9-2, so we flop, well, that's a pretty decent flop. In this situation, I like leading without reads, because we're getting raised by our opponent's stronger ace-x hands on this board. Our opponent's unlikely to c-bet all that often if they missed anyway, or if they have medium pocket pairs or anything like that. They're unlikely to c-bet this board anyway. And even if they were to c-bet, they're never going to continue against a check raise unless they actually have it here anyway. So basically what I'm saying is that if we lead and we get raised, then we get raised, by the stronger hands. If we check raise, he continues with the stronger hands, but he folds out the worse hands. In this situation, we're actually going to pick up some of the weaker hands, some of the 9x hands, because it's much less believable when we lead out here than if we were to check raise and when we're really bloating the pot. So in this situation, I did decide to actually lead, and our opponent called, which made the pot 300 going to the turn. The turn comes off with the 6 of spades, and what I decided to do here is to just go ahead and fire, because given that our opponent calls this flop, as the pre-flop raiser, I think that we're likely to get another call, given that the board isn't very draw heavy. Well, in fact, it's not draw heavy at all. Okay, so we really don't expect that he's just randomly floating us as the pre-flop raiser here. Sometimes he does have like 9x hands here, which call the flop bet, but may fold to the turn bet. But more often than not, he's kind of defined his range here as stronger hands by calling this flop. Obviously, a raise would have defined it as a little bit stronger, but there's a lot more stronger hands in his range on a board like this when there's no draws out there whatsoever. So I go ahead and I fire this 6 of spades turn for about 2/3 pot, and our opponent just calls again, making the pot 720. This now is starting to look like we've actually run into a hand, because he's unlikely to call us with 9x. So I'm really starting to look at ace-x hands as being the large percentage of his range, and not very often are we actually staring at floats from stubborn pocket pairs or anything like that. We're really looking at ace-x here a pretty large percentage of the time. So when we get a river of the 8 of clubs, which is a pretty decent card for us, we have a pot of 720 and we have a stack of 1140 at this point in time. And what I opted to do was to just go ahead and actually overship this river. And the reason being is that if we were to bet 540 here or 480 here into 720, I think we get called by exactly the same range, which actually calls an overshove here, and we probably get called a little bit wider if we overshove because it looks way more full of it than what a value bet size, a standard value bet size looks like on the river. If we bet smaller here, sure, some of the time we get called by the weaker 9x hands, which may have got stubborn, or sometimes pocket pairs in between 9s and aces, which actually get a little bit stubborn and decide to call down. But typically, I don't think that we're getting 3 streets of value out of them hands anyway. So what I want to do here is, on a board like this, which is pretty dry, and our opponent's range is pretty well defined to stronger hands, is to actually just go ahead and go for glory, and just stick them in. Because, as I said, our opponent's hand range here, if they're calling a normal value size bet, they're more often than not, they're going to call the overship anyway. So that this is the type of situation where we need to think about the best way to get value. And in this situation, for me, the best way to get value was to actually overshove. The last value line which I want to talk about is the small bet. And by no means am I saying that I actually played this hand optimally at the time, because the more that I look at this hand, the less I think that I actually did play it all that well. But in the end, it actually worked out for me. Maybe I ran a bit good or something like that. So pre-flop, the stacks were 1500. Our opponent just limped pre-flop, and we checked our options with 6-8 of diamonds. And we got a really one of the best slots we could have asked for, which is ace-2 jack of diamonds. So we flopped the flush. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to go ahead and bet this flop a huge percentage of the time. I don't really like our checking and letting our opponent either have a free card here and watching a diamond roll off on the turn, or check raising here and getting folds a huge percentage of the time. I like just building the pot right now and going ahead and leading, which is what I did in this situation, and our opponent raised us to 160. Now, in this situation, I was probably better off just raising this flop, just 3-betting this flop and trying to get it in, because there's just so many hands which our opponent actually is going to get it in on this flop with, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. But for argument's sake, in this situation, we actually just flatted, and the pot was 380. On the King of Spades turn, which is a pretty good turn card for us, we checked and our opponent bet 320, and once again, like a donk, I just call. Once again, it's probably better to be check raising here, but we'll just go ahead with this and we just flat. On a safe river like this, what I actually elected to do in this situation was to lead to 10. Now, I may have taken this line based on some history. I don't remember exactly, so I don't want to be overcritical of what I've done, even though I'm calling myself a donk. You know, there was more than likely a very good chance why I took this line. But this line in particular, on the river, being at such a safe river and such a great board for us, I like this small bet as opposed to checking or betting bigger. The reason I like this small bet is that we get value out of, weaker hands. We certainly get value out of weaker hands. So hands like, Queen Jack, for example, or hands like King of Diamonds 9x. So hands which actually hit this board, don't have a very strong hands. They can certainly make an odds call here, calling 210 into a pot of 1320, getting almost 6 to 1. It's certainly a good excuse for them. So we pick up that percentage of their range. On top of that, it's a really good. Our bet looks like a blocker bet, so it certainly induces bluffs from our opponent if they have missed flush draws. And sometimes our opponent thinks that they're going for value and sees our bet as a blocker bet with hands like, with 2-pair hands and with for Queen 10, for example, stronger ace-x hands. There's a lot of hands here which are actually going to ship over the top of us, whether it be for value or as a bluff. And that's what this small bet achieves in situations like this. So hopefully I've covered the difference between the second last situation being this one here and using the overbet effectively to using the small bet here to induce our opponent to put as many chips in as we can possibly extract from them. So my final thoughts on this video, and I know that it's been long and relatively tedious, I'm sure, for you guys to listen to, is to remember that these are just examples. Every situation that arises in poker needs to be treated somewhat independently. So you really need to continue to think, and all these situations need to be used as basically a guide. Like you can't just look at a situation and go, oh, I saw him do this in the video, he said to do blah. We need to use discretion, as I mentioned, and we need to play each situation as an independent event and work on that situation based on game flow, based on the tells that you pick up at the time. But this here really, like, I wanted to do this video so that you could see certain situations, common situations, and how you should be thinking in them situations and why. So the ultimate moral to the whole video, this long video, was to stop, think, and plan hands out. So rather than just rushing into decisions and raising here because we have the nuts, and not thinking about which street is the best street of value and how many streets of value we can actually get, we need to actually stop, and we need to think, and we need to plan each hand out as we go. So that's it for today. Good luck in your games. Obviously, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the forum. I'll get back to them as soon as I possibly can. Hopefully the next couple of videos will be a little bit more exciting for you. As I said, good luck in all your games, guys, and peace.